Monish Mahurkar will chair this session. He's now with Agra Capital as their climate transition leader, but he's also been the vice president at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm, and he's worked a lot in business all over the world. So Monish, you're there to chair, and you can introduce the two speakers.
I don't know if we need a few minutes for people to come back into the room if they are taking a break. I don't know. Should we just get started? Okay. All right. So thank you, Ajay and IIEP for inviting me for this session, for chairing this session, and to give me the privilege of facilitating this conversation with two distinguished scholars, both of whom notably are not only leading academics, but both have extensive practical policy experience. Professor Simon Commander is a visiting professor of economics at IE Business School in Madrid and has previously worked at the World Bank. And he currently also runs a consulting firm, Altura Capital, as managing partner. Professor Viral Acharya is currently CV Star Professor of Economics at NYU Stern, and as many of you know, has previously served as a deputy governor at the Reserve Bank of India. So truly an honor to host this conversation with both of them. The topic assigned for this session is rising inequality and business concentration. Now, it occurred to me that both of these topics, both while connected, I'm sure, at various levels, but each is a topic on its own. It's a pretty complex set of topics, both of them. So I think in today's session, if it's okay, we will probably focus a little more on the business concentration side of the subject. And maybe if we get a chance to, with the help of our distinguished speakers, try and explore the interlinkages to inequality as well. Now, just to frame the discussion a little bit, both of these subjects of business concentration and inequality clearly sit at the intersection of economics, politics, and society, and therefore, to that extent, are very complex and challenging to understand. These topics also are areas which often invoke very emotive responses because everybody around the world, not just in India, has an opinion, has a view, and is probably in some way or another impacted by what happens in the business world in terms of concentration and the power of large companies and corporations, and of course, income and wealth inequality. So I think the first order of priority clearly is to first understand dispassionately what exactly is going on. What does data tell us in terms of the trends of business concentration in a market like India? And that's exactly what Professor Simon's paper has done. It's quite fascinating when Ajay shared that paper to see how, building on the experience of having done that analysis previously in East European transition economies, Professor Simon has brought that same analytical rigor to looking at data on business concentration in India. And there are some interesting sort of nuances there that tell us over a period of time what's been going on. And once we hear from Professor Simon on that, we will then invite Professor Acharya to share his views based on his research on how he views this whole topic of business concentration. What does it mean for a number of things like, what does it mean for private sector investment? What does it mean for investment in required infrastructure, large-scale project management, the ability to take business risk? Is it a net positive or a net negative? So these are the questions we would like to talk about and tease out, and of course, hear from the audience as well to take the conversation forward. So with that, without much further ado, if I may invite Professor Simon to present his insights. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Monish, and I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you, Ajay, and your colleagues for the kind invitation to this excellent conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit from our paper, but I'm going to try and put it in the broader context. So rather than sort of mechanically run through the paper, I'm going to highlight some of the main findings and then bring out what I think are some of the conclusions that are not necessarily totally warranted from the paper per se, but which I think nevertheless are worth considering. look, the motivation came from the fact that, well, the background is that Saul Estrin and I did a book back in 2022 on Asia, more broadly speaking, called The Connections World. And it had a large focus on market power, essentially, and the way in which market power was built around not just incumbency, but also the intelligent and effective leveraging of political connections. And this then basically gave us the motivation to start working in India, given the role of businesses, large businesses in India. And we then went out and worked with Naveen and Varun on this. So that's the background. Now, the conclusion that we came to in the book was really quite simple, that actually a lot of the earlier debate about whether it should be the market or whether it should be industrial policy was, in a sense, it missed its target. I mean, there were some issues, mainly Korea, where that sort of came into nice relief. But having said that, I mean, it is very clear right throughout Asia, including in India, that really the dominant industrial policy, if you like, has basically been favoritism towards large business groups. And in that respect, it's been remarkably successful. And just to give a sense of this, if you just simply look at the share of revenues at the top 10 firms in GDP, they range from roughly 10 to 12%, which is China and India, two very large economies, to over 40% in Korea and in Vietnam. So whatever you may think about the efficiency issues behind it, nevertheless, there's no doubt that large directed credits, other favorable access reasons, and the like have been very important in building preferred incumbent business groups. But these business groups are not just average conglomerates from around the world. They're essentially, for the most part, largely family-owned and dynastic business groups. And that's true right through Asia. And there's been a very big debate about this, why this has come into being. Well, a lot of it has been to do with failures in capital markets and the like. But one would, broadly speaking, think that those failures, at least, have been less deep, less pronounced over time. And yet these business groups, if anything, have increased in importance. Now, the feature of most of these business groups in India, just as much as outside, is they're very highly diversified. They really do a hell of a lot of things, even if at the outset, when they start, they don't do very much. They very rapidly diversify, as we shall see. They have extremely opaque governance and funding arrangements, which are normally organized for the benefit of their founders and their dominant families. And, okay, yes, sure. Well, it's an advantage of a business school, but you have to try and perform. Is it on? Yeah. It's on now, I think. Okay. So concentration in ownership really facilitates family control, and the pyramidal structures that these businesses have is also another feature that results in the same sort of outcome. They're extremely persistent over time. Next slide, please. Now, in this paper, what we do is we look at the largest, oh great, it works now, the largest business groups in India, and we focus in particular on the 25 largest family-owned business groups. Now, what's the difference between business groups and family-owned business groups? Well, Infosys, for instance, or Larsen & Toubro would be business groups, and therefore they're not in this list, but these guys are all basically family dynastic business groups. And we do, which is explained in the paper, if anyone wants the paper, I'm happy to send them to it. We merge a number of the families, so for instance, Birla and a couple of others. We put together various branches of the family to form this. And what you can see in the top 25 of these family business groups is that you have some groups that have been there for a very long time. In other words, pretty much since independence or shortly after independence, Tatas, Birlas and the like, and then some newer entrants like Adani, Reliance, and so on. But if you had to make one point, and this would go back to Hazari and others' works in the late 50s, early 60s, is that there's an awful lot of persistence in there. So between 2000 and 2020, which is the scope of our paper, about 6 or 7 of these groups drop out from the list, but most of them basically stay in, shift around, not necessarily by that much. So it's a universe that has a lot of endurance and incumbency. Let's put it that way. Now, actually, if we're talking about market power, you really want not just to talk about concentration, you also want to talk about profits and pricing. But I'm going to say right from the start, that's extremely hard to do, partly because of some of the behavioral and organizational features of these business groups that make it quite hard to pin down profitability. So what I'm going to talk about today is largely going to be about concentration. So it's either going to be about concentration ratios, CR5, 10, 25, or it's going to be using the standard Herfindahl index. And bear in mind, the HHI, a value roughly in the range of greater than 0.25 is normally, well, is commonly considered to indicate relatively high concentration in markets. Okay, now this is the evolution of the Herfindahl in these 20 years. The data comes from Prowess. It's a panel using financial data that they have. There's about 500,000 observations in it as a consequence. So this is the Herfindahl without the state sector, and that is, which is the orange line, and the other side is, no, this is with the state sector, I beg your pardon, the orange, and the blue is without the state sector. And what you can see, obviously, is that concentration goes down a great deal, but it goes down a great deal less if you gut the state sector from it. But nevertheless, it's very clear that insofar as concentration has dropped in these 20 years, a lot of it's to do with what's been happening to public sector companies. Okay, now I'll skip that and go to some of the meat of the paper, I think. Because of the way we put the data set together, we're able to look at fairly high degrees of disaggregation. So for the most part in the paper, we use NIC2 and NIC3. So NIC3 is in excess of 200 sectors. NIC2, which I'm not going to report here, is about 86 or something like that. And if you look then at, these are concentration ratios on the right, these are Herfindahls on the left, and you basically have 5 data points going from 2001 to 2020, then it's pretty clear what's going on. Essentially, the increase in low concentration sectors is both quite strong and reasonably persistent. It doesn't shift very much between 2015 and 2020. It sort of plateaus, as it were. But I also want to pick out at this point something that I think is really quite important. Just look at the high concentration sectors, particularly the very high concentration sectors. And yes, you can see that there's a decline, actually quite a strong decline, bit of uptick after 2015, but it's by no means eviscerated. So roughly, so we can see a decline, but quite strong. Now, if you look over the concentration ratios, you can see that they basically go from a bit over 30 down to, these are CR5s, reminding myself, to about 20. So again, some sort of decline, plateauing in about 2015. Okay, so that tells us something about what's been happening. Now, if we decompose the Herfindahl, what we can see essentially is that most of the action, taking 3 data points, we also have the calculation for the full period, which is very similar, by the way. You can see that most of the action comes through the state, but there's some traction also in the top family business groups, which contribute more over time, significantly more, and the other bits of the private sector contribute very little and very little change. So to summarize, really, there's a declining concentration driven largely by changes to the state sector, but there really are a number of quite important nuances. So only about a third of NIC3 industries could be classed as highly competitive. In other words, an HHI of less than or equal to 0.1. And roughly 25% are actually highly concentrated. So that's quite a significant amount. So, and the metric there is not that last group of greater than 0.75, but greater than 0.5. And the share of industries with low concentration ratios, talking here about CR5s, again, went from 44 to 60 at 2/3, but over 20% again still had a really very high concentration ratio. And then a final little bit of detail, the largest 5 firms controlled over half of revenues in around 15% of NIC3 industries in 2020. So even if the general picture is one of declining concentration, there are more than pockets. There are actually blocks of sectors, if you like, where concentration remains quite significant. Now, let me come then to another feature of this, because the two are related. Concentration, diversification, most of the literature normally thinks of them as substitutes probably, but that's not really a very useful way of thinking about it in India or indeed in most Asian economies. Okay, as I pointed out, most family business groups are very highly diversified. And the thing that our data shows is that not only are they highly diversified, but they've continued to diversify. And that is as true for Tata and Birla and the like, who've been in the game a long time, but it's also true for relatively new entrants like Adani or Reliance. So in 2000, Adani was operating in only 5 NIC3 sectors. By 2020, that number had increased by about 750%. And the same, Reliance a bit less so, but increased by roughly 4 times in the same period. Now, what sort of, there are 2 questions. What sort of diversification are they doing? Are they going into activities that are proximate to what they're already doing, which is in a sense what theory might suggest, or are they going into other sorts of activities? And once they go into new activities and new sectors, do they manage to establish a significant market presence? So let me invert the order and say the first thing is they don't actually do what, in a sense, much theory would predict. They don't go into activities that are reasonably proximate to what they're already doing. So diversification, when we use the entropy measure for what it's worth, shows that FBGs mostly diversify across rather than within strips. So they're going into new activities. And that is unambiguously the case. I think that the table there shows it, the calculations, but I'll come back to that. Now, when they diversify, are they entering into sectors where there's relatively little competition, or are they managing to carve out relatively strong market shares after entry? Now, obviously, we have a very limited period of time to look at it, 20 years at maximum. So we actually take a look at what happens after entering into a sector at T+5 and at T+10. And in some cases, we actually can observe both at T+5 and at T+10, but in many cases, we can only observe at T+5. So what we find is that entry is indeed much less likely when there's a high share of market share taken by incumbents. But even when taking that into account, entry for the most part has not led to the accumulation of large market shares, okay? So there's an awful lot of entry. Most of that entry is across rather than within, but it does not, for the most part as yet, have led to a great deal of market power being accumulated, or large market shares. And it begs the question, which we can't really answer in the paper, and which is certainly worth asking, is why are these groups diversifying so actively and in this particular sort of way? Is it just about experimentation? Is it sort of neck and neck rivalry? Your competitor goes in and the like. I have no answer to that, but it's certainly worth questioning. We do look at pricing. My discussant Viral has done a very nice paper for Brookings some time back that also did something very similar. And there we can actually see that although there's not much drift, if anything slightly downwards in the markup, sales to variable cost, then post 2014, 2015, we get some uptick in it. So at the end of the period, average markups, insofar as they're accurately measured, are actually reasonably significantly higher than they were at the beginning of the period. And then finally, well, not finally, but final slide, let's just put this all in revenue, so in context. So these are the family business groups, and these are their total revenues summed up over all their subsidiaries and the like, for the top 10, the top 5, and the top 25. And although you can see that there's some dip after 2010, it's not a particularly large dip. And the shares that they have are really very significant. The top 25, their revenues account for, at the peak, roughly 20% of GDP. And the top 5, as I mentioned at the beginning, are something like about 12%. Okay, let me just come to a very quick conclusion on all of this. Let's try and put this a little bit in context. Concentration has probably fallen, although there's evidence of markups drifting upwards. But there's absolutely no doubt that in certain sectors, family business groups have staked out dominant positions, and they hold on to them. Now, how should this be addressed in policy terms? So the paper doesn't deal with it, but in our book, we try and ask some of these strategic issues. And the answers, I think, are really both interesting and extremely challenging. One model, of course, goes back to 1930s US and Roosevelt, and that was basically to break up conglomerates. But it was a unique moment after the Great Depression. There was enough accord for that, and I don't honestly, right through Asia, seeing that same type of underlying or latent consensus being present. Other measures that try to address this include changes to taxation, changes to permitted business formats, ownership, and the like. And actually, right through Asia, including in India with the not so relatively recent Companies Act, limits on the number of subsidiaries and levels have been imposed, and that has made some progress. But in general, I would argue that most of those sorts of changes have been extremely well avoided by incumbents. So what does that leave you with? Well, it leaves you with some sort of difficult propositions. One, essentially, is to try and address the reasons for why family businesses persist and why these sort of very opaque governance structures go about it. And the measure that seems to have some traction, at least if we look at Korea, is to impose successor or inheritance taxes. And this seems to be the first occasion on which, for instance, Samsung is no longer going to be a family business after the current generation, apparently. And that was, by the way, a policy that the Japanese introduced quite effectively. There are other sort of tax instruments that can be used, but ultimately, the main questions concern the very close connections between business and politics and the discretion and really the privileges that come with that. And those, well, they're beyond the scope of the paper, but they're certainly extremely hard to dislodge and will be, I suspect, very hard to dislodge in India. So thank you for listening. I hope at least that's given some measure of the issues at stake. Thank you very much.
Okay. Oh, so two very insightful presentations. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Viral. So I think we have another 15 minutes or so to wrap up the session. So let's open it up for questions from the audience. Nari, you want to kick it off? Is there a mic there?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I think I learned a lot from it. I think, firstly, of course, the comparisons to the chaebol, the keiretsu, there are different family business or related business models that are there. The one part you did not go into, which I don't know whether it's fair to use that metric to compare Indian businesses, is some of the emerging monopoly concerns in the US relate to companies with network effects. That is, you get a customer, then the next customer joins you. Once you get to a certain size, no one else can break in. So that analysis, I don't know whether it's applicable to this here or not. The second related question with regard to these family businesses is that looking at the US capital markets, we hardly have any companies that are more than 100 years old. They seem to have the mortality of a human being. GE is largely gone. GM is pretty much gone. IBM is gone. Microsoft is just celebrating its 50th anniversary. So maybe we got 50 more years of Microsoft and maybe 60 for Google. And then they're all gone. So that model that delivers maybe, let's say, efficient services for the people, but don't have corporate longevity, how does it map to a country like India with say, historically poor banking? You want to get into a new sector, you're far better being a Tata, getting into a new sector because the bank loan can be funded by the whole conglomerate, rather than be a new startup and say, give me a loan, I want to get into a new market. So I feel like the role of banking, the history, and also, of course, we only have 35 years of this liberalization when we have fair comparisons with what it is. So I'm no fan of the giant family business, but I'm just wondering whether under Indian conditions, they may indeed be reasonable answers to customer demands for choice, reliability. You sign up for a phone, you know it'll still work 5 years from now because Reliance is behind it, etc.
Thank you. Shall we take one or two more questions? Shall we go at the back first? Yeah.
Thank you. Myself, Surendra Kumar. I'm a PhD second year student in George Mason University. I have one question for Simon. When you are talking about the diversification of these family-owned business, are they creating like going into greenfield projects, or they are just doing the acquisition like we seen in the cement sector, particularly recently, that just a big group buy out another group? They are not creating anything in a capital form or like increasing production capacity in the country. And sir, Acharya sir, I have one question from you. You shown in your presentation that after like 2016 or 17, there is a huge rise in merger and acquisition. It is happening because of your new law, insolvency and bankruptcy code that comes in 2016-17, because you know that is very strict. Like after 19 days, anybody, like any seller, any bank, like smallest person can go into say, oh, they did not pay me anything. I just want to, they have to appoint a representative there. Like that is might be a reason of this thing happening.
And I think gentleman here in the middle. Yeah.
I just want to follow up on what you said. If you look at the S&P 500, 70% of the companies turn over every 20 years. If you look at that list that Simon put up, I bet you anything that the top Indian 25 companies have been there for the last 100 years, okay? And we all know that capital is most productive when it gets allocated to its most efficient use, okay? And I'm surprised I'm at a conference on economic development and the word capital has not been mentioned even once, okay? So my question to Professor Acharya, and you worked with the Reserve Bank of India, is what 70% of the assets in India, banking assets, are controlled by state-owned banks. So even though they're not, I mean, banks have been denationalized, what is the Reserve Bank of India doing to allocate credit more efficiently in the economy and hopefully getting to that Viksit Bharat stuff that everybody keeps talking about.
Shall we give the panel a chance to address these questions and we'll come back again? So I don't know, Simon, if you want to start with.
Okay. Is this working? Yeah. Can you hear? Yeah, great. So thank you. Those were great questions. I mean, on network effects, yeah, they're key in this country, aren't they? I mean, that's absolutely clear. But obviously, the industrial structure, not just the balance between manufacturing and services, but the nature of those services, looks, at least for the moment, very different from what it is in the Indian landscape. So my guess is that network effects will and are becoming more important over time. But in the domains that we were studying, I think possibly that's not a big part of the story yet. But that it will. Your second point, in a sense, is a bigger issue, which is about what sort of model of industrial structure and churning gives rise to not just growth, but also innovation. And what I didn't mention, what I didn't mention was that if you look at conventional measures of innovation, whether it's process or product or what some people call radical innovation, then most of these guys don't do much of anything, really. And actually, right through Asia, I mean, on the radical and the product innovation side, much of the action is really concentrated in China and Korea. And that brings me back to the point that maybe they're not doing much innovation because they can sit on rents, they can get other sorts of privileges, they can shift pricing power, they as Viral pointed out, their financial performance, insofar as one can see it accurately, looks pretty healthy in the last 5-10 years. So all of this is not a model of churning and creative destruction giving rise to innovation. It's a model of, okay, well, sorry about that. It's a model of incumbency, scale, scope, and it can be very good at certain things and has been very good at certain things, but it's obviously not good at what you just described. And I would say that that's a tremendously big drawback. And on the point about greenfield M&A, we didn't really look into that in enough detail. But if I'm looking at Viral's slides, then obviously M&A seems to be a very large part of the story. Having said that, I mean, probably one might think of, say, solar as being greenfield. And then the question is, you know, why is Adani, for instance, becoming such a big player in that? Well, obviously, a lot of it is to do with support from government and incentives and the like. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong in that, for God's sake, because certainly in climate change right around the globe, everyone is putting some sort of funding. There is a big market failure, and it did. But the nature of the funding and the funneling of the funding suggests that some of the pathology I just described, and Viral has described, is continuing. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I fully agree with Simon. I'll make a couple of points on IBC because I think that touches upon some of the common themes that came up. So we had this concern as well. And so we've actually done that plot on M&A, taking out the IBC acquisitions. It's still exactly the same pattern because the IBC cases, at least the early ones, were concentrated in a few sectors. And that is not, those are not the only sectors that are driving the aggregate pattern. But I think IBC is actually the crucial part of the capital allocation point in my view. I think Indian equity markets, in my view, have always been fairly good, actually. You know, we have not had too much of a bailout or a forbearance culture happening through the equity markets as much, other than when you had something like the global financial crisis and, you know, then there was some liquidity support provided to the mutual funds and so on.
In contrast, banks have been the mechanism through which credit allocation in India has been heavily compromised. And I would actually very hesitate towards asking Reserve Bank of India to do something about the capital allocation, because historically that is what they did. They did sectoral allocation. They used to decide how much credit will get allocated by the public sector banks. And since the term Hindu undivided family was used today in the morning, I can't help say that essentially the government of India, public sector banks and Reserve Bank of India, until I would say 10 years back, functioned like a Hindu undivided family. So there was no accounts. Accounts were all fungible between these three sets of entities. What the IBC has done is that it has finally made credit a market-driven mechanism, that if a company borrows and can't pay the banks, now there's a mechanism. For a short time, Sarfezi, as Professor Khanna mentioned, was doing the job. Then there was a wrinkle, there was a Supreme Court ruling that made Sarfezi ineffective. But IBC, even though it has not stuck to the timeline that was desired, it's actually changing ownership structure. It's changing hands of who's running the companies. So the corporate sectors have deleveraged since then. I think it's an interesting hypothesis whether conglomeration picked up, but I don't see why, because the turning point is 15. IBC was not used that effectively until 17 and 18, but the trends had started a little bit earlier. But that's an interesting possibility that no one wants to lose control. And so if you can get a large company to acquire, effectively you're deleveraging because you're getting out of the firm. It's like the simplest form to delever is to cash out. I think the question to ask is, how do you nail down the political economy of this? And that requires, in my view, some clever research design to understand which transactions are perhaps happening with some government support, which are not. But they are so sector specific that it's hard to pin them down beyond a point. I've asked this question to Competition Commission several times, that why are they allowing all these M&As to go through when it's creating more and more concentration? And their view is that whatever they do has to be exposed. That if they find that concentration increases and it leads to collusive behavior in price setting that you can demonstrate, then we will act upon it. But we are not going to prevent M&A deals happening ahead of time. I don't know if that's the right approach, but that's the response that they have.
Thank you. Just before I come back to the audience, I have a quick follow-up. And in defense of the conglomerates, since we have definitely got very strong arguments why there are challenges, I wonder, as both of you explained, this whole transition from the state sector to these big conglomerates, is the underlying rationale that in a developing country like ours, where basic goods and infrastructure, cement, steel, oil and gas, energy, and the like, just like that was taken up by the public sector in the 60s onwards, that somebody else had to take on that mantle. And whether if you either diluted these concentrates or broke them up, whether those large-scale projects with the kind of project management, the type of capital, the type of risk-taking that is required, would it then happen? Because either the state could do it through public sector, or do you still need these conglomerates for that, or is there a better solution? It's a question, I guess.
Yeah, at least my response would be that I think I'm always trying to answer this question of why the private capex is low and the pricing power is high. And I think Simon and I couldn't get into it as much, but even entry in the sectors where concentration is high has tended to be low. All of that seems to suggest that this may be a level of concentration that's inefficiently high. But clearly more work is
Can we just take two questions and wrap up? No, I think, sorry. I know there were lots of hands up.
Talk over the coffee.
Our apologies, but please feel free to continue the conversation with our distinguished panelists, and let's give them a round of applause for a brilliant discussion.